The mail-order bride was left for dead, until the Lakota carried her through the storm. The rain had already turned the road to clay by the time Clara Devereaux realized the wagon wasn't coming back. She had fallen when the wheel struck a rut, her trunk spilling open into the mud like the inside of a life no one wanted anymore. Letters, lace gloves, a Bible that had soaked through and bled ink across its pages. She called out once, twice, then stopped because even her own voice sounded foolish in a place so empty. The driver had shouted something before the wagon disappeared into the storm, but the words were lost under thunder. Somewhere behind her, lightning ripped across the horizon, bright enough to show the cross of the mission she'd been promised to, still hours away. The man she was meant to marry, Samuel Hart, was supposed to meet her there, but he had sent no one, and now the trail was a river. Her boots sank to the ankles as she tried to stand, her bonnet dragging heavy with rain. She could feel the fever coming back, the same one that had taken her mother in Kansas, and for a moment she thought about lying down right there in the mud and letting the storm finish what the men had started when they threw her off the wagon for slowing them down. But then she saw movement, a horse cresting the ridge through the sheet of rain. Its rider came like something carved from the storm itself, tall, wrapped in a hide coat, his braid dark and heavy with water. She stumbled back, slipping in the clay, unsure if he was ghost or savior. When he dismounted, the earth seemed to quiet under him. He was Lakota. His face calm and unreadable, his breath steady despite the wind that howled around them. "You fell," he said in a low voice that carried through the rain. "They left me," she answered, though it came out like a confession. He looked at the abandoned trunk, then at her trembling hands. "You're not dead," he said. "Not yet," she whispered. He stepped closer, studying her eyes as if to measure whether she still belonged to this world. "Then you ride," he said, lifting her as easily as if she were made of air. She tried to protest, but her body gave up before her words did. He set her across his horse, climbed behind her, and pulled the blanket from his shoulders around them both. The warmth hit her like mercy, shocking in its gentleness. The rain didn't let up, but his presence made it bearable. She watched the ground slide away beneath them, every hoofbeat erasing the road she'd been left to die on. "Why?" she managed. "Storms take enough," he said simply. "No need to help them." She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of his face through the rain. He wasn't looking at her, only at the horizon, his jaw set like a man who'd decided long ago that saving people was easier than explaining why he did it. The world blurred around them, mud, wind, thunder, and then she felt the rhythm of his heart steady behind her, beating louder than the storm. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes and let someone else carry the weight. When Clara woke, the world smelled of smoke and pine. She was wrapped in a wool blanket near a small fire built beneath an overhang of rock, the rain still whispering against the stone outside. For a moment, she didn't know if she'd survived, or if the afterlife had decided to be merciful. Then she saw him, the Lakota, sitting cross-legged across the flames, cleaning his rifle with the precision of a man who trusted silence more than words. His coat hung near the fire to dry, steam rising in ghost-like ribbons. Her body ached everywhere, but the warmth was real. She tried to speak, and her voice came out rough. "Where are we?" He didn't look up. "High ground. Safe till morning." She pushed herself upright, dizzy. "You should have left me," she muttered. He met her eyes then, calm, unblinking. "They already tried that," he said. "I don't repeat mistakes." The firelight caught his features, sharp but not cruel. She realized she'd never seen anyone so still, as if the storm outside had tried to shake him and failed. "You didn't have to help," she said. "No one does," he answered, "but sometimes it rains too hard to pretend we don't see." She stared into the fire, the orange light trembling on her hands. Her wedding dress, meant to be worn in a church with candles and hymns, now hung in tatters over her knees, streaked with mud. "He won't be waiting for me," she said, half to herself. "Men like that only wait for wagons that bring gold." "Then he's not waiting," he said simply. She almost laughed, the sound breaking like glass. "You think it's funny?" "No," he said. "I think it's done." His certainty startled her more than the thunder had. "What's your name?" she asked. "Talon," he replied. "Yours?" "Clara," she said, then added softly, "I used to be someone's bride." "Now you're someone's survivor," he said. She looked up sharply, but he'd already turned back to the fire. Outside, lightning flashed again, far away this time. The storm was leaving, yet its echo lingered in every drop that slid down the stone. Talon stirred the fire with a stick, then handed her a tin cup of something warm. She tasted it. Bitter roots and smoke. "Drink slow," he said. "It'll fight the fever." "Why do you care if I live?" she asked, too tired to hide the edge in her voice. "Because I've seen too many left for dead who were still breathing," he said, "and because someone once found me that way too." The flames crackled between them, each spark lifting into the dark like a prayer that didn't need a church. She felt her heartbeat slow, the warmth seeping deeper, until the sound of the rain became something gentle instead of cruel. "Will you take me to the mission?" she asked. "If that's where you want to go," he said. "And if it's not?" "Then we find where you can start again." His words landed like a hand on her shoulder. Steady, unhurried, sure. She stared at the fire until it blurred, her vision swimming with exhaustion. "I don't even know how to begin again," she whispered. "You already did," he said. "You woke up." She tried to smile, but couldn't, so she let the firelight speak for her, and before sleep took her again, she thought she heard him whisper something low in Lakota. Soft, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. When she opened her eyes a final time before drifting off, he was still there, unmoving, watching the fire as though keeping it alive was the same as keeping her alive too. By the time the rain broke and light touched the rim of the hills, the air had turned sharp and new, the kind of clean that only follows ruin. Talon was already saddling the horse when Clara woke. The fire burned down to a soft glow. She blinked against the brightness, her limbs stiff but alive. "We ride," he said without looking at her. "The valley floods fast when the storm passes." She pushed herself upright, clutching the blanket. "Where are we going?" "East," he answered. "To higher ground, then the trail to Red Hollow." The name felt distant, like something she'd dreamed before she'd ever left Kansas. "There's a town there?" "Enough of one," he said. "People trade, people forget." He helped her stand, steadying her when her knees faltered. She flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. "You can walk?" "I'll try." "Trying isn't walking," he said, then softened. "But it's close enough." They started slow, her steps heavy in the mud, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her. The world smelled of wet earth and smoke. In the distance, the sky still wore bruises from the storm, purple fading to pale gold. The sound of the river followed them like a ghost refusing to rest. "You said people forget," she murmured. "Is that what you did?" He didn't answer right away. "For a time," he said. Then I remembered I was supposed to keep others alive long enough to forget too. She glanced at him, confused. You help strangers often? Not often enough, he said. But when I don't, I dream of the ones I should have. There was no pride in his tone, only quiet confession. She looked away before he could see the tears that rose uninvited. By midday, they reached a field of blackened grass where lightning had struck. The ground steamed faintly, the air heavy with the smell of burnt sage. Looks like the earth caught fire, she whispered. Sometimes mercy leaves scars too, he said. Keeps you from thinking it was a dream. They stopped by a creek to rest. He washed the mud from her arms with careful hands, his touch neither tender nor distant, simply necessary. You don't need to do that, she said. I do if you're to keep walking, he replied. You think I'll make it that far? You already have, he said. The rest is easier. She laughed weakly. That's not true. No, he admitted, but sometimes lies help us take the next step. When they rode again, she sat behind him on the horse. The rhythm of its movement steady beneath her. The land began to change, trees giving way to open prairie, sunlight drying what the storm had drowned. What's Red Hollow like? She asked. New, he said. Too young for ghosts, too small for hate. Maybe that's enough. And you? I don't stay anywhere long. She hesitated. Then why stay for me? He was quiet for a long time before saying, because storms don't end just because the rain stops. She didn't understand at first, but when he shifted slightly, and she saw the faint scar that ran along the side of his neck, she did. As the afternoon wore thin, they crested a hill where the world seemed to stretch forever. Clara looked out and saw a horizon washed clean, rivers glinting like veins of light. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's borrowed, he corrected softly. The earth lends peace but takes it back if we forget what it cost. She leaned her cheek against his shoulder, the motion instinctive, unplanned. He didn't move away. The horse slowed, and for a long while neither spoke. The only sound, the steady rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind carrying them forward. When the sun dipped low, he finally said, Tomorrow you'll see Red Hollow. She nodded, her voice a whisper. And after that? After that, he said, you'll decide what mercy looks like when it stays. They reached Red Hollow just as the sun broke through the final rags of cloud, turning the wet roofs to mirrors and the muddy street to gold. The town was small, barely a dozen buildings framed by wind-beaten fences, a general store, a blacksmith's shed, and a whitewashed church with no bell yet hung. People stopped what they were doing to stare. A Lakota man on horseback carrying a woman in a torn wedding dress was not the kind of sight this side of the prairie saw every day. Talon rode straight down the main road, his back straight, his gaze fixed forward, his silence heavy enough to keep judgment at bay. Clara sat behind him, her hands clasped in the blanket around her shoulders, too aware of every eye but too tired to care. He stopped in front of the boarding house, where a sign hung crooked from one chain and a woman with gray hair and sharper eyes stepped out onto the porch. You can't just ride in here with trouble, stranger, she said, though her tone carried more curiosity than anger. She's sick, Talon replied. Needs food and dry clothes. The woman's eyes narrowed on Clara, then softened when she saw the trembling. Inside, she said. Quick, before the gossip gets faster than the rain dries. Inside, the air smelled of bread and soap, and the warmth nearly made Clara cry. Talon lowered her to a chair, his hands careful, almost reverent. You'll stay here, he said quietly. Rest, I'll bring your things. What things? She asked, her voice small. Whatever the storm didn't take, he said. The innkeeper, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Avery, returned with a cup of broth and a stare that could have peeled secrets from walls. "You're safe here," she said. "We don't ask questions until a person's ready to answer." Clara tried to thank her, but the words caught. "The Lakota will be paid for bringing you," Mrs. Avery added. Talon shook his head. "Not payment. The river owed her a second chance." The older woman frowned. "River don't owe anyone anything." "It does when it gives back what it nearly took," he said simply, and turned toward the door. Clara's hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "You're leaving?" He paused. "You'll need to walk on your own now." "Where will you go?" "Where storms still talk," he said. "You'll find me if you listen to rain." She wanted to ask him to stay, but the words felt too heavy to lift. He touched the edge of her blanket lightly, as though sealing a promise, then stepped out into the brightening day. Through the window, she watched him mount his horse and ride toward the river, his silhouette fading into the glare of wet sunlight until he was gone. Mrs. Avery's voice broke the silence. "That man walks like he's already said goodbye to everyone once." "Maybe he has," Clara whispered. She drank the broth slowly, the warmth filling spaces that hunger hadn't reached in years. When she looked down, she saw that her wedding ring was missing, lost somewhere between the wagon and the storm, and for the first time, she didn't reach to find it. She only sat there in the stillness, the sound of dripping water outside echoing like the river breathing again. Days passed before Clara could walk without trembling, but Red Hollow was the kind of town that understood broken things. Mrs. Avery gave her work in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and folding linens, while the townsfolk pretended not to wonder where she had come from. In return, Clara said little, letting her silence be the answer to every question. She rose with the dawn, worked till sunset, and every evening she stood by the back window watching the road, half hoping to see the Lakota rider appear again out of the haze. The storm that had nearly killed her now lived in memory, a sound she couldn't forget. The drum of rain, the rhythm of his heartbeat against her back, the warmth of the blanket he'd wrapped around her shoulders. One morning, when the chores were done and the town still quiet, she followed the path behind the boarding house down to the river. It wound behind the trees like a secret, silver in the morning light. The current was slow now, soft as breath. She knelt by the edge and touched the surface, her reflection rippling until it disappeared. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the water or the man who'd carried her through it. When she stood, she saw something caught in the reeds, a small piece of red cloth tied around a feather, frayed but whole. Her breath caught. It was his, the same marker tied to his horse's reins the night he'd found her. She lifted it gently, brushing away the mud, and for a moment she thought she heard his voice again, low and even. Storms take enough. No need to help them. She smiled through the tears she hadn't known were waiting, and tied the feather into the braid of her hair. That night, while serving supper, the preacher stopped by the inn to bless the house. He was kind, with tired eyes that spoke of more funerals than weddings. "You new to Red Hollow, miss?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said, "but it already feels older than I am." He chuckled softly. "That's how we know a soul's found where it belongs." After he left, Mrs. Avery handed Clara a folded envelope. "This came for you. No name on it, but the writer said you'd know." Clara opened it carefully. Inside was a strip of rough paper, folded around a small sprig of sage, and a single line written in steady hand. "The river circles. When the wind turns warm, listen." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She pressed the paper to her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady for the first time in months. The world outside smelled of rain again, and she knew that somewhere beyond the hills, the Lakota was still riding, following storms so others could survive them. Weeks slipped by, and with them the edges of her fear. She learned the rhythm of the town, the blacksmith's whistle, the school bell, the children chasing dogs down the main road. Every face became familiar, every task simple, almost holy. Yet each time thunder rolled in the distance, she stopped whatever she was doing and looked to the sky, not out of dread, but in quiet remembrance. She no longer waited for him like someone missing a piece of themselves. She waited like someone who'd learned mercy can travel farther than love. One night, before bed, she stepped out into the rain barefoot, lifted her face to the clouds, and whispered, "You can rest now, Talon. I'm home." The rain answered with a softness that felt almost like his hands, steady and sure, reminding her that storms weren't always something to run from. They were sometimes how heaven reached down to return what the earth had nearly taken. The season turned slow in Red Hollow, the trees budding green again, as if the land itself was remembering what forgiveness looked like. Clara worked each day from dawn until dusk, her hands learning new ways to be useful, kneading dough, mending torn curtains, teaching the Avery boys their letters by lamplight. The town had stopped whispering about the woman in the ruined wedding dress. Now they simply called her Miss Clara, the quiet one who prayed by the river before breakfast. The only thing she carried from her past was the red feather in her braid, and a gentleness that made even the hardest men speak softer when she passed. Yet every night when the wind rose, bringing with it the smell of wet soil and the low hum of thunder rolling somewhere far off, her heart stirred like something half awake. She'd step to the window, fingers on the sill, waiting for hoofbeats she couldn't stop hearing. But the road stayed empty, and the silence stretched between one day and the next. Then, one morning, while the mist still clung to the fields, she heard it, the faint thud of a horse approaching slow. She walked out onto the porch, breath held. A rider appeared through the fog, not Talon but a boy no older than 16, his coat too big and his eyes solemn. "Message for a Miss Clara Devereux," he said, handing her a folded scrap of hide. Inside, in the same firm hand as before, were 5 words. "The storms remember the saved." There was no name, no mark, just that. She pressed the hide to her lips, the warmth of the ink bleeding into her skin. Mrs. Avery came out behind her. "Bad news?" she asked. "No," Clara said softly. "Just the kind that doesn't need explaining." That evening, when the last dishes were washed and the lamps turned low, she walked down to the river with a loaf of bread and 2 candles. The current was calm now, slow and gold under the setting sun. She set the candles adrift, one for the woman who had been left for dead, the other for the man who had carried her through the storm. The flames floated steady, their reflections rippling like hearts that refused to drown. "If mercy can stay," she whispered, "then so can I." Behind her, the town bells began to ring, slow, unhurried, like the heartbeat of a place that had finally learned peace. The breeze lifted her hair, catching the feather and making it shimmer. For a moment, she swore she heard his voice carried on the wind, quiet and sure as ever. "Still walking, river woman." She smiled through tears, whispering back, "Still living, storm man." The candles drifted out of sight, the light fading into the bend where the water met the horizon, but she didn't follow them. She stayed, standing barefoot in the mud, knowing the river would carry her words farther than her feet ever could. That night, she slept without dreams, the thunder distant and kind, and when morning came, Red Hollow woke to sunlight that smelled of rain. A promise kept. Weeks turned into months, and Red Hollow learned to breathe again. The crops grew tall, the church bell finally hung in its steeple, and Clara's laughter began to sound less like surprise and more like belonging. She no longer looked for storms to test her, but she still walked to the river each dawn, her skirts brushing against the grass heavy with dew. The feather in her braid now faded but never frayed. One morning, as she reached the bank, she noticed the water moving faster than usual, swollen from the rain that had fallen all night. The sound reminded her of that night in the mountains, when thunder had shaken the sky, and a stranger's arms had felt like sanctuary. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer that wasn't about faith so much as gratitude. When she opened them, she froze. Across the river, half veiled in mist, stood a rider, tall, still, his horse dark against the pale light. He didn't move or call her name. He only sat watching her, the same way he had watched the storm break over her that night long ago. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. She knew it was him even before the wind shifted and carried the faint scent of sage and smoke across the water. She took a step forward, her boots sinking into the soft earth. But he raised his hand once, not to stop her, not to beckon her, just to acknowledge that he still remembered. Then, just as quietly, he turned his horse and disappeared into the fog, his shape swallowed by the morning. Clara stood there long after, the mist clinging to her skin, her breath trembling but steady. She didn't cry this time. She didn't need to. The river between them wasn't a wall. It was the proof of everything they'd survived. When she finally turned back toward town, the sun was rising, gold spilling across the fields, catching the wet grass and turning it to fire. Mrs. Avery waved from the porch, and the children ran out to greet her, their laughter ringing clear. Clara smiled and brushed her fingers over the feather tied in her braid. "He found the storm," she murmured, "and I found the calm. The day stretched ahead, wide and merciful, and though she never saw the Lakota again, she felt him in the wind, in the quiet strength of the river, in the peace that stayed long after the rain had gone. Autumn came softly to Red Hollow, bringing gold to the cottonwoods and a hush to the fields. The boarding house grew busy with travelers heading south before winter, and Clara found herself managing the rooms with an ease she hadn't known she was capable of. Every night she lit a single lantern in the window that faced the ridge road, not as a signal, but as a quiet habit. Something in her that still believed the world could guide a soul home by light alone. Mrs. Avery teased her about it sometimes, but never told her to stop. "Hope's cheaper than oil," the old woman said once, and Clara smiled, knowing that hope was the only thing that had ever saved her. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, she sat by the hearth with the 2 Avery boys reading aloud from the worn Bible she had salvaged from the storm. The ink had bled so badly that only fragments of verses remained, but she filled the missing words with her own. Less scripture, more mercy. The boys fell asleep before she finished, their heads resting on her lap, the fire casting slow shadows on the walls. She looked into the flames and thought of Talon, of the storm, of the way he had carried her through a world that wanted her gone and never asked for thanks. In the flicker of light, she almost saw him again, his profile cut against thunder, his eyes steady through chaos, his silence saying everything. She whispered into the quiet, "You were right. The river circles." The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the window pane, and for a heartbeat she thought it was hoofbeats again, coming up the hill. But when she opened the door, there was only snow drifting sideways and the faint glow of her lantern cutting through it. She stood there barefoot, the cold biting her toes, and felt something like peace bloom in her chest. He wasn't coming back, not because he was gone, but because he didn't need to. What he'd left in her was more than presence. It was endurance. She turned back inside, closed the door, and tended the fire, humming a Lakota tune she barely remembered. The room filled with its rhythm, low and steady, like the heartbeat of a story that refused to end. And when she finally blew out the lantern in the window, she didn't feel darkness, only the quiet assurance that mercy had already found its way home. Winter settled over Red Hollow in long white silences, and the world seemed to pause beneath its weight. The river froze in places, but Clara still walked there each morning, breaking the thin ice along the edges with the heel of her boot so the water beneath could breathe. The feather in her braid had faded to the color of old wine, the red thread frayed by wind, yet she refused to replace it. It had carried her through too much to be exchanged for something new. The town had grown around her, steady and sure, a schoolhouse built beside the church, the smell of bread and cedar smoke in the air, the kind of peace people earn rather than find. She had become part of it now, the woman who smiled without needing to explain why, the one who listened when others spoke of loss as if she could translate it into forgiveness. But that winter morning, as snow fell soft as breath, something changed. Downstream, a shape moved along the opposite bank. A horse, dark against the white, a rider cloaked in furs, his posture too familiar to mistake. Her heart tripped once, twice, then steadied. She didn't run, didn't wave, only stood watching as the rider slowed, dismounted, and touched the frozen water with his hand as though greeting an old friend. Even from that distance, she knew it was Talon. He didn't look toward her. He didn't have to. The act of returning was enough. He knelt, scooped a handful of snow, let it melt in his palm, and whispered something she couldn't hear but felt all the same, a benediction, a farewell, or perhaps both. Then he stood, mounted, and rode along the river's curve until the mist swallowed him whole. Clara exhaled, the cold catching in her throat like a prayer half-spoken. The water at her feet rippled, the ice cracking in delicate lines, and for a moment it almost sounded like laughter, low, free, alive. She smiled through tears, whispering, still circling. The clouds broke, and sunlight spilled across the snow, turning it to silver. Behind her the church bell rang once, its echo carrying down to the valley, blending with the river's voice until both became one sound, the sound of mercy that never ends, only changes its shape. She turned back toward town, her footprints crisp in the snow, and though she walked alone, the path no longer felt empty. It felt known. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it came all at once, melting the snow in a single week, filling the air with the sound of running water and the scent of wild lilac drifting through every open window in Red Hollow. Clara stood by the riverbank, where it curved behind the church, watching the thawed water rush past with the same quiet strength that had carried her once before. The trees were budding, their branches reaching toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. She wore a plain cotton dress now, her hands rough from work, her face sun-touched, her eyes calm. No one looking at her would have guessed she had ever been the woman who'd fallen from a wagon and been left for dead. But sometimes she could still feel the weight of the storm in her bones, a reminder of what it took to be remade. Children from the school ran past her, laughing as they tossed pebbles into the current, and she smiled at them, the sound of their joy louder than any hymn. The preacher called from the bridge, asking her to join the picnic on the green, but she only waved. "In a moment," she said. She knelt, dipped her hand into the water, and whispered, "You can rest now." For the first time, she didn't mean herself. The wind picked up, bending the grass, and she thought she heard a familiar voice in it. Low, patient, steady. The river circles. She closed her eyes and let the memory of his arms, his silence, his mercy wash through her. The feather had long since been buried by the seasons, but she no longer needed its color to remember. Everything around her was marked by what he'd left behind. The kindness in the townsfolk's greetings, the gentleness in her own steps, the quiet that filled the world when storms finally passed. She stood, brushed the mud from her skirt, and turned toward the town that had once pitied her, but now simply called her one of their own. The sun slipped through the clouds, laying a golden path across the fields, and she followed it back home. Behind her, the river murmured softly, carrying away the last of the ice and the last of her fear. Red Hollow would bloom that year brighter than anyone remembered, and though no one spoke his name aloud, every time the rain came, they said the same thing: how mercy always finds a way back, and how sometimes the ones who leave us in the storm are the very reason we learn to stay. Clara paused at her doorway, looked once more towards the horizon, and whispered, "You carried me farther than the river ever could." Then she stepped inside as the sky broke open in sunlight, and for the first time since the night she was abandoned, she knew she would never be lost again. Thank you for watching Echoes of the West. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe so more souls can find light after the storm. Would you have carried a stranger through the storm, knowing no one would ever thank you for it?